Today I'm going to go through a couple more mods that I've done in the last week or two. I've fitted a new poly fuel tank to get a bit more range. The standard tank had 130 and now I've got 180, so an extra 50 litres. I went poly because I've seen a few YouTubes. The one that stands out is Matt and Holly on their Troopy, where they cracked a steel long range tank, I think halfway through the Simpson, and that caused them a fair bit of grief. I'm trying to keep the weight down, so the idea of the poly not being able to crack seemed to be the choice for me. So I got an ARB Frontier tank. It's pretty easy to fit. All you really need is a trolley jack and a few hours. I think it took me about 3, maybe 4 hours to fit it. Most of it's pretty straightforward. If you've done any home mechanicking, you'll be able to do a tank. The other thing I fitted was a bull bar, and again, it's pretty straightforward on a 70 series. There's no body panels to cut. Like the last bull bar I put on was a Prado. And by getting out the saw and actually chopping through the front part of your Prado, like you mark it, you check it again. After 3 checks, then you cut it, but it's a nerve-wracking thing to cut through a perfectly good body panel to put a bull bar on. So a Troopy or a 79, pretty easy. All the original stuff unbolts in a straightforward manner. As part of the install for the bull bar, I did put the carbon winch on. I got a carbon 12,000 pound, I think it's called a Scout 12,000. And I got that because it's fairly light compared to other winches. It's 26 kilos, I reckon. I had a couple of questions before I bought it, and I rang up Carbon's head office in Victoria, I think it was. They were great, answered my questions. When I bought it, and I had to switch a couple of things around to install it, rang up the people in Victoria. They were great. The first thing you have to do is disconnect the sender from the loom, and there's a plug at the rear on the tow bar rail, just on the passenger side. Just clips apart, that's pretty easy. And the next job is draining the fuel out. It's a lot harder than I thought. I couldn't get a tube down the filler hose through the S's, so I just took the S's off, like there's an rubber S bend. Took that off, put in a siphon straight into it, and eventually we pulled out about 100 litres of diesel into various jerrys. Undoing the back of the tank's pretty easy, just 2 bolts that hold the straps in, and once you undo the 2 bolts, basically it just falls down, so you sort of got to catch it with a trolley jack. It's not that heavy. Once all the fuel's out of it, I think it weighed 33 kilos, so you could probably do it and just catch it. I use a trolley jack, that seemed to be the easy thing to do. And just make sure the wires are out of the way when you lower it, and then you can pull out the old tank. The straps come out second. There's just a couple of pins to pull out there, and they came out really easily. And you'll see the tank in 2 parts. There's an internal part for the tank, and there's a guard, like a stone guard, underneath it. And once that's out, you basically have to get the sender, which is in the old fuel tank, pull that out, and that goes in the new fuel tanks. You've got to have a different arm on it, which is pretty straightforward to swap over. And just out of interest, I pulled out the little filler cap, and there seems to be like a backflow flap on it. That stops the fuel going backwards up that when you're sloshing around. The next thing is to put the pipes and put the sender into the new unit. Pretty straightforward. I had a bit of trouble getting this on, so I had to use a heat gun to make it soft. And I had a bit of a problem, which I didn't find out till later, that the return fuel hose was too short. I don't know if it's just for the 2.8, but I was about 40 millimeters too short. I made it fit, but I actually went to ARB and complained about it, and they gave me a slightly longer piece of hose, so I've got to, I guess, drop the tank and fit the new bit of hose if I want to fix it properly. Once I had the hoses attached and the sender installed, it's pretty easy to manhandle. It's only 22 kilos. There's a couple of straps you put on to insulate the tank from the chassis, and actually the adhesive on this was pretty crap. You can see it just, you push it down, it just pops up. So I went and got some my trusty T-Rex from Sudal, which glues sort of anything to anything, and just stuck a gob of that in there, and that fixed the issue. Underneath the tank there's 2 replacement straps. The standard factory ones don't get used again, and you need to clip on some rubbery anti-vibration, anti-wear strips, and they just clip on by hand, pretty easy. Then I installed some split tube on the wiring for the fuel gauge sender, just because it's sort of flapping around on top of the tank. I thought it might be good to protect it. And then I lifted the tank up, assuming that I'd be able to get the pins through the back of the tank for the straps. But by the time you get it up there, it all fits up quite nicely, but there's just not enough space to put your hand up to put the pins back in the straps. So after 5 minutes of dicking around and trying to see if I could be clever about how I'm going to get those pins back in, I gave up and dropped it back down again. And the second go, I attached the straps before I put the tank on. So it's a little bit agricultural because you've got to bend the straps before you put the tank into it. But yeah, once the pins are in and the tank sort of rotates up from the back, I just held it with a trolley jack. And after that, it was pretty easy to line up the line up the bolts on those straps, and just nip them up with the rattle gun, and then got to check the specs, got a torque wrench, and then torqued up the bolts to whatever they were supposed to be. So that was it. That was the actual physical, keeping the tank up in there. And the last job after torquing it up was just reattaching the rubber S-bends, so you can actually fill it from the tank. So I put in 20 litres at the farm, and then I drove 10 to the servo, and I put in exactly, I don't know if you can see that there, 160.03 litres that clicked off. So it's exactly a 180 litre tank. Getting the bull bar on was again pretty straightforward. I've done a few before. It was so nice to not have to cut anything like I had to do on the Prado. First job was taking everything off. You don't really need to follow the instructions, just follow your nose. It's pretty straightforward how things come apart. I weighed everything as it came off, and you can see there the scribbled some weights on all the bits to see what I was taking off compared to what I was putting on. And it's actually quite difficult to find out what an ARB bull bar weighs. It's not on their website, they don't seem to publish it anywhere. And in fact, the only place I found it was a YouTube video. This bloke had the same issue. He couldn't find any data, so he did the whole lot himself, got all his scales out, and before he put his bull bar on, he weighed everything. So he got about 88 kilos. Getting the data for the winch is pretty easy. It's just on their website. It's 26.7 kilos. So with the weights of what I was adding, less the weights that I was taking off, it came to about 85 kilos, which is sort of what I expect for my front springs, so I'm pleased about that. So the bull bar weighs about 115 kilos. I tried to get it on with a trolley jack and some wood. There was no way I was getting up there without scratching anything. So in the end I had to call up a mate, and he came up, and the two of us could lift it up. Once you can lift it up onto the little horns, it's pretty easy. Once the bar's bolted up, you've then got a wiring loom to install, and my big hands would not fit between the light and the battery. I just couldn't get it in there. In the end, I just unbolted the light from the front of the car, did change the wiring loom. There was no way I was going to get my hand down there, and it made it a lot easier to get into the blinker plug as well, which also has to be jumpered. Bolting and torquing it up was pretty straightforward. The only thing we forgot was we didn't read the instructions properly, and we forgot to put in these little spacer things, and the torque wrenches weren't clicking like we'd expected, so we stopped, read the instructions, and there's these little spacers that have to go between the OEM rails and the tube on the bull bar that goes over them. Otherwise you're crushing the ARB channel because there's an air gap between the chassis and the channel. So we worked it out, undid them, and slid in these spacers, and it torqued up quite nicely. I'm pretty happy with it all. I think it looks really nice. And I just did a dummy fit of the spotlights and the winch controller just to see where they were going to go. But that's something for this, the coming week to get all that wired in. I'm pleased to have those three things done: the tank, the winch, and the bull bar install. Not major jobs, but with everything else going on in life, it took a couple of weeks to get it all finished. The next thing to do is get the spotlights wired up, get the winch wired up, and I need to take some wires through into the cabin. So I've got to get an ignition feed to control all my lithium distribution box stuff. So that's the next thing for the next video. I'll see you then. See ya.